Welcome back, everyone. We are starting session 2, the global LGWP propellant transition. This session will cover the global perspective on the propellant transition. Presentations will include discussions on how similarities and differences in regulatory thinking may impact propellant MDI development strategies, an area for study harmonization that could minimize potential challenges for drug developers seeking approval in different markets. Today, we have a wide range of speakers representing a number of regulatory agencies. We have Karolina Törneke, Assistant Professor and Senior Clinical Assessor from Swedish Medical Product Agency, who will be presenting EMA's perspective. Nithyanandan, Nagercoil, Senior Medical Assessor from MHRA. Orla, Ógáin, Senior Pharmaceutical Assessor, as well from Medicines and Healthcare Products, MHRA UK. We have Mark Boelens, Global Senior Director, Product Stewardship and Toxicology, representing industry, Honeywell. Geraldine Venthoye, Chief Scientific Officer and EVP of Inhaled Technology Platforms, again representing industry, Victoria. We have Giuseppe Randazzo, Senior Vice President, Sciences and Regulatory Affairs Association for Accessible Medicines. And after the presentations, we do have on the panel Health Canada representation by Paul Wielowieyski, drug evaluator in the Division of Biopharmaceutics Evaluation. With that, we'll go ahead and start with our first presentation on considerations from the global propellant transition.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to this conference. It has been great to participate and listen to all interesting talks. I have been with you since yesterday, although I've been on distance. So no dinner yesterday for me. Yes, I'm Karolina Törneke. I work for the Swedish Medicinal Products Agency, and this is also me. I have the same kind of disclaimer as everyone else, no conflict of interest, and this is my own view presented at this conference. Yes, there is a need for action. I don't need to repeat this because it has been said so many times over the last days. So what could we do from an EU perspective, from the EMEA, to facilitate this transit to more climate-friendly propellants? Well, we have started to think about it, and we have summarized our thoughts into a question and answer document, which has been available for a year now. I assume you have seen it. When we started this work, we wanted to summarize both internally between all those agencies within EU so that we had one common view, and also in dialogue with industry during our scientific device sessions. So the question and answer is the summary of all those ongoing discussions. We started with deciding that we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So we started to look at what guidance have we in place already. Propellants are excipients, and we would like to regard the change of propellants to the extent possible as any change of excipient. Which means our question and answer document is applicable irrespective of what kind of product, if it's a generic or a brand leader, whether it's a completely new product or an extension of an existing product, or it could also be an updated product like a type 2 variation, where everything, but the propellant remains the same. So all different kinds of applications and products should be covered. Then we start to think about the difference between a novel excipient and an established one. So when the propellant is novel, as it is right now, obviously, as there are no approved products, and then we expect to see all data as outlined in our guideline on excipients. We want to see non-clinical data in line with ICHM3. That is obvious from what could have been expected before we published our question and answer document. What we want to see also from a clinical perspective is 3 different studies targeting what we are most concerned about, which would be then local intolerance. We are not worried about systemic safety because the half-life is short, the exposure level are low, but we want to see data on ciliary function to make sure that mucus clearance is not affected. Also, we want to see data on airway sensitivity. And this study should be done in asthmatics that are with hypersensitive airways. The ciliary function study could be done in healthy volunteers. And then we want to see at least one standard safety study, a phase 3 study, 3-month duration to pick up whatever adverse events there might be. Still, we are interested in the propellant, not in the active substances. So ideally, the study should be conducted with propellant only. Now we know that it's, for practical and ethical reasons, not feasible to do such a long study in healthy volunteers. So we would accept the product applied for, of course, but we could accept any product with a new propellant used the way it's intended to be used. You need to carefully examine the adverse event pattern, though, trying to distinguish to the extent possible what is the difference between the actives and the propellant, considering then that the actives might very well mask adverse events from the propellant. If you have a bronchodilator, you might not see bronchoconstriction as a side effect. If you then extrapolate those findings to a product with a glucocorticoid, there might be an issue. So we need to have some thinking along those lines to try and separate, to the extent possible, the negative effects, if any, from the excipient. Then, for each new product, we want to see information of the propellant. If it is novel, full data package. If it's established, we don't need to see anything, basically. And then it depends on what kind of product it is. If it's a completely new product, new API, that has a certain set of guidance. It could also be an abridged product with or abridged applications for a generic product or an extension or whatever. But our standard guidelines applies. And you can also vary the product by changing the propellant, keeping everything else the same to the extent possible. And then, of course, you should still give us all information on the propellant, and you should comply with our guidelines on orally inhaled products. There are two of those, one on quality and one on therapeutic equivalence. And both of these are under revision. We have received loads of comments. Thank you very much if you are in the audience and commented on this. We are working our way through all comments right now and will publish updated versions early next year. So for the time being, you could comply with either the old one or the new one or something in between. You can always argue your way through that. Quality data for each new varied product. Nothing unexpected. Therapeutic equivalence. Yes, you are well familiar with our three-step approach, and what is new now to the revised guideline is that we discourage from going to step 3. If you go for a generic product, it's probably better to reformulate than trying to fit with step 3 data. Step 1 then, we have a list of requirements that should all be fulfilled. When I listened to FDA yesterday, I understood that the set of requirements are approximately the same, but we have then set an acceptance criteria for the particle size distribution, and if they are fulfilled, then it would be a bio-waiver. So we don't ask for kinetic data in all cases, but only if there are deviations from similarity in particle size distribution, or if other criteria are not fulfilled. Those are very strict, should be within 15%. And we realize that it cannot be done with accuracy for certain of the stages because it's too little substance. So we have also criteria for stage grouping. Kinetics, also quite similar to what I heard yesterday. To mention something which is different would be that we accept partial AUCs for rapidly absorbed substances, and we will require data with spacer, both with and without spacer. Clinical data then. Well, if you have clinical data and can show similarity, we will accept those data. It's not that we don't accept them, it's that we discourage from using them because we find them highly insensitive. You need to show acid sensitivity, and that is terribly difficult, I'm afraid. Our idea is to be meaningful, you need to show at least that 2 products with the same strength are more similar to each other than the test product is similar to deviating strength, which is normally factor 2 if there are several strengths. So we need something that is less than a factor 2, and we decided on acceptance levels that would be 67 to 150%. So it's still more than bioequivalence. It's definitely more than the 15% we accept for in vitro criteria, but it's tight. It's difficult to comply with, and we know that. Product information. The product name may be kept. We don't like promotional statements, but there might be a need for other type of warnings and information because of the new propellant. With that, I'm at the end of my speech. Thank you very much. I hope you heard me to the end. It's so difficult to be on distance, but I hope it worked out well. Thank you.
Now an opportunity to listen to the current MHRA approach on data requirements for the transition to low global warming propellants. We have Orla to start us off with the presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm just going to thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to the organisers of the workshop for giving us this opportunity to speak about the current MHRA approach on data requirements for this transition. So this will be a two-person presentation. So I'll talk first and give a brief introduction and touch on quality aspects, and then I'll pass to my colleague, Dr. Nagercoil, who in a pre-recorded session is going to talk about the non-clinical and clinical aspects as well. So I won't spend too long on this because it's been really comprehensively discussed earlier in the workshop. But this is the second major transition that we're seeing in propellants for PMDIs. So the reasons why we're seeing this, obviously we have the international action, we have legislation in different territories, domestic climate targets, and anticipated market availability and supply constraints coming up for the current propellants. In the UK, we have general guidance from the Environmental Agency and Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and this is available on the uk.gov website. However, medicines make up a very small component of the F-gas market, and we don't currently have UK-specific medicines guidance. Currently, the two approved F-gases in UK PMDIs are the HFI 134A and the 227EA. HFA 134A making up the bulk of the UK PMDI market. And I think this is similar to most of the territories as well. And the candidate low propellants, low GWP propellants that we've been hearing about, the HFA 152A and the HFO 1234ZE are not currently authorised in any UK medicine. So in terms of the how, for marketing authorization holders and company proposing to make a change in the propellants in the UK, the regulatory agency is the MHRA. So we are the regulator of medicines, medical devices and blood components for transfusion in the UK. So when a company decides they want to change the propellant, they would need to come to us with an application, either as a new application for a new marketing authorization or as a variation to an existing UK marketing authorization. And the criteria that would be applied are on the screen here. And just to note that these are similar to the European Commission categorization guidance on the line extension versus variation. And from interaction with the current marketing authorization holders in the UK, we expect that most of these changes will come in under a variation category, albeit this will be potentially a very large data packages. In terms of licensing routes in the UK, so we currently have two routes. We have national licensing route, and we also have an international recognition procedure route. And Nithya will talk a little bit more about the international recognition procedure route, as it might be of interest here. But essentially, this is licensing route that allows the MHRA to take account of opinions and decisions made by other reference regulators in accordance with certain criteria. So when the MHRA are considering what our requirements are in terms of to support this transition, we are looking at our experience for the previous CFC to HFA transition. But having said that, we are aware that this was not always a straightforward change, and in many ways there was, maybe a bigger change at that time. So there were GMP requirements that needed to be fulfilled. In some cases, there was product redesign, and manufacturers found that there was PK clinical changes on the reformulation. This time, we are aware that there have been developments in manufacturing processes and device technology. There's increased product understanding and a greater understanding of respiratory disease in target areas of the lungs across the industry. In terms of regulatory expectations, the UK MHRA is now an independent regulator post-EU exit, so we may not necessarily align in all cases with the EMA. Over the last few years, we've also been having extensive scientific advice meetings directly with marketing authorization holders and companies in the UK to discuss with them specifically their development plans and to give our opinion and advice on these. So just to talk a little bit about the quality requirements. So I won't have time in detail to talk in detail on the quality requirements, but just to emphasize that the requirements for this change are similar to the requirements for any variation or new application in the space of PMDIs. We require a really high level of assurance of quality, and this will also support the equivalence and usability considerations. In terms of references, we would refer to the pharmacopoeia requirements. So these would be the British Pharmacopoeia and European Pharmacopoeia requirements. We would also refer to ICH guidelines and also to those European guidelines, so those EMA guidelines that were in place at the time of the UK exit from the EU. And these guidelines that were in place at that time have since been transposed to the human medicines regulations. And I've put a list here on this slide. This is a non-exhaustive list, but shows some examples that may be relevant here. So for excipients, these proposed propellants are obviously novel. They're not authorized in any UK medicines at present for the inhalation route. So all the requirements in line with the novel excipient would need to be met here. We would need a robust pharmaceutical development package. And in terms of process validation, the manufacture of PMDIs, we would consider this to be a non-standard manufacturing process. So this would dictate the process validation requirements. The finished product specification would need to be reconsidered in light of the change and fully justified. Depending on the nature of the changes, there may be further changes required to the container closure system or to the device. And in these cases, there may be further requirements in line with devices legislation, and we would recommend that companies discuss this with us in advance as well. We would require a robust stability package as well to support the reformulated product. In terms of the specific tests and studies for PMDIs, we would refer to the Pharmaceutical Quality Inhalation Guideline. So this is the guideline that's the current version on the EMA website. As I said, the version that has been transferred to the HMR. In terms of the in vitro equivalence, similarly, we would refer to the guideline on the requirements for clinical documentation for orally inhaled products, known as the OIP guideline. And this is the current version as well, rather than the draft revised version. And specifically, we would refer to the section 5.2 criteria here. But just a note from the MHRA, at the moment, due to the novelty of the propellants, we're not considering an in vitro only approach here. And specifically, our concern is for the following two criteria in section 5.2, that the qualitative and quantitative changes should not interfere with the inhalation behavior of the patient and should not affect the safety profile of the product. And with those comments, I'm going to pass on to Dr. Nagercoil, his recording, to talk about the non-clinical and clinical aspects.
Thank you, Orla, and good afternoon, everyone. Continuing on from what Orla has presented, I will give you a brief overview of the non-clinical and clinical data required by MHRA to support transitioning to novel propellants of low global warming potential. My presentation will also focus on areas of difference as compared to other regulators where we are aware of it. On the non-clinical data, the requirements are a standard battery of studies with the new propellant. These include PK characterization, acute and chronic toxicity studies, including characterization of safety pharmacology, genotoxicity, carcinogenicity, developmental and reproductive toxicity studies. Juvenile toxicity studies, if needed, should be conducted. In addition, a bridging study with the final product will be needed. The main studies should use appropriate exposure and be GLP compliant in accordance with ICH requirements. If any specific studies have not been conducted, for example, due to feasibility constraints, or if there is a delay in submission of some study data, then these should be suitably justified. The MHRA will be pragmatic and risk proportionate and will follow a weight of evidence approach, particularly when clinical data or data from literature is available. Moving on to clinical data requirements for the transition to novel propellants with low global warming potential. As Orla alluded, our approach is based on our learnings from applications where CFC was replaced with HFA. and the hybrid applications of oral inhaled products, which demonstrated similarity to approved reference products. The requirements stem from the CHMP note for guidance, replacement of CFCs in MDIs, and the OIP guideline, where UK was involved in the development of these guidelines. We are aware of the recent Q&A on transitioning to low global warming potential propellants published by the EMA. And while our requirements take this into consideration, we may not be fully aligned with it. The overall objective of the clinical product development is to show that the product with the new propellant is therapeutically equivalent to the currently approved product containing the old propellant. Accordingly, the development should be in a stepwise manner as described in the OIP guideline. Therefore, we accept that PK equivalence after lung exposure, which is characterized with charcoal block, is a sufficient surrogate endpoint for equivalence of efficacy. And likewise, PK equivalence after total exposure without charcoal block is an acceptable surrogate for equivalent safety. In case equivalence cannot be demonstrated with PK studies in healthy volunteers, then equivalence on pharmacodynamic endpoints or efficacy endpoints would be needed. In addition, equivalence of the two products need to be shown when used with a specific spacer. This can be done either by in vitro, and if it's not possible to demonstrate equivalence by this method, then by in vivo studies. While the equivalence studies provide us reassurance on the equivalent efficacy and safety of the active substances in the product, we would need a safety study of at least 3 months duration to provide reassurance on the lack of any safety concerns due to the action or potential actions of the new propellant, and to rule out a detrimental interaction between the new propellant and the active substance on repeated use. This is considered adequate based on our learnings from CFC to HFA transition. Safety in children should be justified either by extrapolation from adults and or by inclusion of some children in the clinical safety study. The approach should be justified in the dossier. Post-marketing monitoring for long-term safety and for any rare and unexpected events is considered adequate. The main difference on safety requirements, as we understand from the Q&A published by the EMA, is that they could be reassured by the study by a safety study with the new propellant alone or with any active. But for the MHRA, as the study is also expected to provide data on the lack of detrimental interaction between the propellant and actives, we expect safety data with the finished product. And our strong steer in scientific advice to companies is to conduct this study with the product and not with the excipient alone. Whilst these are our expectations, we are open to sound justifications. Our principles in accepting a justification will be a focus on patient safety. Here we consider lack of efficacy is a safety concern too, a pragmatic and proportionate approach. So deviation from recommendations can be accepted if appropriately justified. And in the worst case scenario where justifications are not accepted and we require more data on safety, then there would be a slight delay in the introduction of products with new propellants into the UK, whilst some post-marketing safety data from other regulatory regions where it is already approved is collected and submitted. The next important question is, when does the new propellant stop being novel and becomes established? Is it after the first application is approved, when data with every class of active is available, or when data with every active is available? Our approach to this is that this will depend on the emerging data and the robustness of the justification for extrapolation. The points we will look to infer is not only the safety or tolerance of the novel propellant and its impact on distribution of the active substance, but also whether there are any potential interactions with the active. Expectation is that propellant will not be pharmacologically active, but we will look at the emerging data to see if we can conclude on this point. The EMA Q&A recommends study on the effects of new propellant on ciliary function and potential for airway sensitivity reactions. We would consider this as supportive data. The Q&A document also recommends a safety study with the propellant alone. However, as previously mentioned, we would strongly recommend the studies with the finished product, as this is more clinically relevant. That, in brief, is an overview of the clinical and non-clinical requirements by the MHRA. As you may be aware, the MHRA have started an international recognition procedure for medicinal product applications in the UK since January 2024. And understandably, there is considerable interest on how this procedure actually works practically. So I present a brief overview of the important takeaway points on this process in this slide. The IRP relies on an assessment of trusted regulatory partners, which includes EU, US, Japan, and the countries in the Access Consortium. IRP can be used for both initial and variation applications. There are two types of IRP procedures. Type A, which follows a 60-day timetable, or Type B, which follows a 110-day timetable. In either of these procedures, if there are major issues, then the procedure may revert to a standard national timetable of 210 days. The detailed criteria based on which applications fall into either recognition A or B can be found in the link on the right. The essential requirement is that the reference regulator should have done a full standalone assessment. The MHRA will do a targeted assessment of these reports rather than a full review of the dossier. The MHRA will retain the authority to reject the application if the evidence is not considered to be robust. The interpretation of the evidence and the authorization of the product information will take into account the UK clinical context and the need for maintenance of consistency with previous decisions. Overall, we expect that most decisions will be consistent with the decision of the reference regulator. However, there is likely to be some differences in outcome and many more differences in detail, such as in warnings, precautions, indications, and sometimes risk management procedures that can be expected. And in all cases where there are differences, the company can expect to get a full rationale or reasoning behind these differences. We usually take such differences for consultation with our independent experts, the Commission on Human Medicines, before communicating this to the applicants. With that top line of IRP, I would like to conclude our presentation with our heartfelt thanks to the organizers and the audience for this opportunity to present our views and exchange ideas in this workshop. Thank you, and we are open to take any questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, and we will keep the questions to the end of the entire presentations. So switching gears now from the regulators to an industry perspective, I'd like to ask Mark Boelens, Global Senior Director from Honeywell. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introductions. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the workshop here for their consideration to invite actually a manufacturer of a low GWP propellant. Because at the end of the day, without the propellant, no transition. Representing a company involved in manufacturing and the selling of low GWP F-gases, it's obvious that we do care about the climate. So last Sunday, I traveled from Brussels here, deliberately in economy class. I only took public transport, including a metro ride from the Capitol Hill, where we have an office, to Rockville, totaling for a CO2 emission of about 1.7 metric tons, which is a 75% reduction compared to a situation where I would fly in business class. So I did my bit for this week. Let's switch gears now, and we'll talk about the substance. I have 3 topics for you today. I'll start with a perspective on the climate change. Then I will speak in more detail about our innovation and regulatory journey. And last but not least, I will conclude with a few perspectives from an excipient manufacturer's standpoint. I'm a scientist, so my assumption is that I don't need to persuade the people in this room that we all have a consensus about the global warming. Since the transition of the CFCs to HFA back 20 years ago, the temperature kept rising, actually with the most rapid warming in the past few decades. So I'd say the transition to low GWP propellants we are discussing today shall happen actually without undue delay. During the past two decades, I think it's fair to say that there were two very, very important phenomena with regards to the climate change that were studied in depth. On the left side, you see the ozone depletion. On the right side, the global warming. With regards to ozone depletion, we all know that the chlorinated molecules, they generate radicals upon degradation in the atmosphere. And those radicals then attack the ozone layer. With regards to the global warming, these halogenated gases, they stay up there for years, therefore preventing Mother Earth releasing its heat, which is called radiative forcing. And I think while the very stable CFC F gases actually were developed and placed on the market as novel refrigerants, mainly to address the incidents in the industry with regards to hazardous ammonia and flammable hydrocarbons, I think both the scientific community and the regulators realized that those same CFCs were actually the main culprit for the ozone layer. And this is what I mean with the title of the slide, Regulation Drives Innovation, because we had those insights. Montreal Protocol got adopted, industry innovated, removing the chlorine from the molecules. Later on, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, and then the subsequent introduction of the EU F-gas regulation in 2006 allowed us to come up with what I call a fourth generation of F-gases, namely called hydrofluoroolefins, abbreviated as HFOs. And it's worth pointing out that already in 2010, the US came with its first CAFE standard in that regard. The fourth generation F-gas that is in the spotlight today is meanwhile known as Solstice Air medical propellant, exclusively used in MDI applications. You will observe from the chemical structure that it's a chlorine-free molecule, and therefore the ozone depletion potential is zero. In addition, the carbon double bond actually ensures a rapid degradation in the atmosphere. Therefore, the lifetime is only 19 days, and that explains what we call near zero GWP potential of 1.37 CO2 equivalent. Just to put that in perspective, I added a table on the right side where you can see where we come from and where we are today. Actually, Solstice Air allows a more than 99% reduction in the global warming. Last but not least, Solstice Air also has been tested according to EN and UN test guidelines as non-flammable. And that, of course, allows manufacturers of MDI devices to operate in an environment where ATEX certification is not required. And also, according to EMA guidance, MDI devices would not need to be labeled as flammable. When it comes to reducing carbon emissions, according to the World Economic Forum report of earlier this year, Scope 3 emissions often make most of the well, the largest portion of a company's footprint. And I think this is exactly the reason why responsible pharma companies such as AstraZeneca decided to transition to a near zero GWP propellant, since it allows them to significantly reduce their Scope 3 emissions. I think you also saw the article in the Financial Times where the CEO, Pascal Soriot, a pretty visionary guy, I'd say, is actually undercompensated for all the work he did in driving the climate change transition. Let's switch gears now and talk about the propellant development and the related regulatory pathway. As we all know, R&D starts always with an unmet need, and in this case, it was not a need from the patients, but it was a need from society to do something about the global warming. And then following the identification of an unmet need, industry starts to generate ideas to come up with solutions. A new molecule coming out of R&D needs to be safe, scalable, and of course, fit for the formulation. And with solid scientific data in place, companies then pursue regulatory filings, such as the submission of a drug master file, ultimately to enable global access. As you can imagine, this all takes tremendous amount of time. An R&D cycle easily exceeds 10 years, which is impacting investments and also the related risks for the companies involved in the supply chain. The following slide summarizes all of the non-clinical data that were generated during the past decade to establish the safety profile of the excipient. With regards to the high-tier tox studies, it's worth pointing out that the tox package, according ICH requirements, includes two-year carc studies in mouse and rat, again underscoring the safe profile of the propellant. With respect to the regulatory filing status of the excipient propellant, at present, I'm happy to confirm that the drug master files that Honeywell submitted are active and ready to be referenced in several jurisdictions across the globe, including the US, China, and Japan. And you may have picked up from the press that in the European Union and in the United Kingdom, for at least one low GWP propellant containing MDI product, the clinical trials were successfully completed and submitted to the respective competent authorities. Over the past days, we heard a lot about supply chains, certainty of supply, availability of the products. Well, I can say that with regards to market readiness, Honeywell built its CGMP propellant pilot plant back in 2020, and only two years later, we had a successful startup of a commercial CGMP plant in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And obviously, over the past years, and we continue to do that, we provide support to customers with regards to the safety of the propellant, the formulation with the propellant, and also regulatory support in the jurisdictions where needed. To conclude, from the R&D cycle and the regulatory journey, Honeywell clearly identified a few significant challenges, adding a lot of complexity. One, the technical performance and the safety criteria to successfully develop an inhalation propellant is very strict and extensive. Actually, identifying such a compound is extremely difficult, but we did it. Second, the regulatory requirements for new excipients are complex and require comprehensive data packages. And there is a lack of harmonization across the jurisdictions, which is also adding complexity. And then last but not least, regulatory assessment and approval may also be lengthy. If we want to speed up the transition, we need to come up with good ideas to accelerate all of this. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to Sarah and thanks to the organizers for allowing me to speak today. It's a slightly different type of talk. I don't usually talk about anything other than the science, but today I'd like to talk to you about the business considerations. And that's because those of you in industry will know this very well, and this will all be very obvious to you. But it's come up quite a few times over the last two days, so I'm not the only person really thinking about these things. And really, without a strong understanding of what the business considerations are and the impact of all of these changes on businesses, really, we cannot come to the right solutions in a timely fashion and avoid the shortages that we talked about earlier. So the aim of my presentation really is to give you those insights so that all of us can be on the same page in terms of the considerations that companies go through in the decision to reformulate a PMDI, or importantly, not to reformulate, in some cases, a PMDI. I want to convey the balance that is needed between the drivers for the change, obviously the environmental drivers and cost drivers that are hitting us in the industry, and the need obviously, and the need to keep medicines on the market for patients, and balance that with the commercial viability of the switch solutions that companies are working on, and potentially the decisions that will have to be made ahead of entering into some very long and costly development cycles. The talk will touch upon a little bit on the environmental drivers. We've heard a lot about that, so I'm not going to dwell on that too much. I'll give you a little bit of background about my company, Vectura. We are a CDMO. We've been working in the PMDI space, previously a Sky Pharma, for over 20 years. I myself was part of the original CFC to HFA transition, so we've been doing this for a very, very long time. And most of our experiences come from the development and the commercial management of the product Flutoform. This is not a discussion about what is happening with the Flutoform, and so I start off with a waiver to say that nothing that I will be saying is specifically related to Flutoform and is not the strategies of Vectura or of our licensees, but actually what I'll be talking about is true of any PMDI and perhaps all PMDIs. So we've heard about this a lot already in the last 2 days. I'm not going to say it again, but clearly the drivers come from the F-gas regulations that we've known about for quite some time in Europe. It comes also with the consideration of PFAS now, particularly if 227 is involved in your product, but also remembering that certain certain canisters are coated with also coatings that could be considered as PFAS, and there may be PFAS also in other elements of your supply chain. In the UK, and you can see a picture there of some NHS incentives for green prescribing, we already have a situation where prescribers are being asked to consider green prescribing in their treatment choices, and we already see evidence of switching from PMDIs to DPI alternatives. Luckily, we have a number of companies that took early action. You see them there, Chiesi, GSK, AstraZeneca. We've heard from these companies over the last couple of days, and thank goodness they took action when they did, because if they hadn't, none of us would be here talking about this today, and we wouldn't have propellants that have gone through all the toxicology and have DMFs for us to be able to use in our products. You can see the timelines that are involved on the right-hand side. Again, this has been talked about over the last 2 days, but you can see the kind of phase downs of the F-gas usage, both in Europe and in the UK, the targets that are being talked about. And although these are in years to come, the fact that this is happening has already significantly increased the price of current propellants. And it is the economic drivers around the products that we're making, the loss of margin on our products, or being able to manage to very, very small margins, that is really driving the transition, actually even before the need to phase down in the timeframes that you see there. So just to say a little bit about Fluidiform, because I think it is a good example of a globally available product, but a product that is not available in the US or in Canada. It is an ICS LABA. It does contain 227, so both a PFAS and an F-gas. It's indicated in asthma, and it's available in 3 strengths and 2 presentations. So when we talk about transitioning products, we typically don't talk about transitioning 1 SKU or 1 presentation. This particular product is available in 9 SKUs because we also have a 2-week product available in Japan. It is marketed by Mundipharma in the EU and the rest of the world, and by Cure in Japan, and Japan is actually a very important market for us. So it's also indicated in pediatrics. And so we've heard a little bit about spacer, and of course, you know, because it's indicated in 5 years and above, a recommended spacer is mentioned on the label. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the business case that all companies need to think about before they actually push the button on the investments that are required to be able to support the developments of these reformulated products. We know what the drivers are, and we know that the outcome of these business cases should support a commercially viable switch solution, i.e. that you can recover all of your investments, and obviously that you have some predictability around the recovery of those investments in terms of the risk that you see and the uncertainty that you see in the business case. But all business cases have a net present value, a value of the product that you need to show that needs to be positive, but that net present value is risk adjusted. And so you overlay the probabilities for success in being successful in reformulating your product, but in any uncertainty or risk associated with actually achieving it in a certain time frame for a certain cost, you will reduce that calculation of value, and therefore you will have a risk-adjusted NPV. And if that is not positive, you may not enter into the reformulation of your product. And clearly, one of the big uncertainties around that risk has been the regulatory frameworks and pathways that we're going to be asked to follow. I'll talk about some of these elements of the business case in the next slides, but it starts off by really getting, for products like ours, which is not commercialized by ourselves, but by partners, we need to have the support of all the marketing partners in all of the territories in order to do this. We are the developer of the original product, and so we do have that wealth of data, many, many batches, and we talked about how that might be beneficial in the switch to be able to look at that data. But in most cases, these products are mature products, and the originators of the products or the developers of the products may not even be around still. But first off, we need to look at whether or not it's technically feasible. I'm not going to go through all the quality requirements. We've talked about that a lot already, but a lot of these business cases are stage-gated, and were stage-gated in terms of showing that it is feasible technically to be able to actually have an equivalent product, and by that, then entering into the investments for the rest of the program. So, can we actually have an equivalent product? Can the formulation be compatible with the cans, valves, actuators, and production equipment? This will determine the level of change, and we talked about how the level of change could be looked at, especially in situations where a variation of post-approval supplement may be considered. Is the manufacturing similar? Are we on the same manufacturing lines, or do we now have to switch manufacturing lines? And if we do have new manufacturing, can we manufacture to the same process capability, yield, and operating costs? Because obviously that underpins the commercial viability of the current product and may also underpin the margin and commercial viability of the switch product. If you have to adapt your manufacturing equipment, there will be obviously for the flammable propellants, a need for ATEX rating. Any capital investment or CapEx investment in manufacturing will need to be recovered, and that is usually recovered in the cost of goods. So then, obviously, a big area of uncertainty and risk to manage is the regulatory framework that you're following. And having clear and consistent and pragmatic regulatory advice across all the major territories that are relevant for your product will provide you with the greatest leverage. Having one development program that you can leverage across all of the territories is the most ideal situation. You're not having to have many parallel programs or deal with huge deviations between the different territories. Obviously, and we've talked about the need for clinical studies, but the need for the clinical endpoint studies in particular that drive huge development costs are unclear in terms of their outcome and probability of success will clearly significantly impact your business case. Toxicology packages were not available when we first started out on these reformulations, but now we do have DMFs. We have the first products being approved, and we look forward to a situation where they do move from an unapproved excipient to an approved excipient and allow business cases to be more underpinned with certainty. PFAS is still an uncertain situation. We hope to have good outcomes there in terms of the use of the HFO propellant in particular. One thing we haven't talked about in the last 2 days is the role of the MDRs. So we are talking about devices. If we make changes to devices, if there are significant changes to our reformulated product, we also have to get clearance from the notified bodies. And that clearance needs to come ahead of a submission for the final product switch. That is an unclear timeline and has to be something that is negotiated with the notified body. So obviously there's some tactical considerations here. If we are talking about variation, do we group variations if there are a number of changes that are needed? Do we get some variations through ahead of the switch, or do we get the switch of the propellant first and then do other variations afterwards? So there's kind of regulatory tactics that we have to deal with as well. Cost is a big factor in business cases. Security of supply and predictability of cost in the supply chain was key for us to be able to make a decision to reformulate. We saw, and I've talked about the increasing costs of propellants. We now in Europe have to deal with F-gas fees, quota delegation fees and purchases, and all of this has significantly increased the cost of goods of the product. We have single suppliers of some of these propellants. That creates risk in the supply chain. It's not unusual for PMDIs, but it does create risk for us. We have been asked by regulators at times, and there has been no mention of that in the last 2 days, so I'm glad to see that. We've been asked to stockpile propellants to secure our supply. But stockpiling propellant requires tens of millions of working capital to be tied up in companies. It requires hundreds of isotainers, storage of isotainers, and really is not a feasible solution to this type of situation. So cost of goods, an understanding of that, an understanding of your process and process capability, yield, operating costs, all of these things secure manufacturing margins. That margin evolution of your current product before you get to the switch product, and then after you've switched, is something you really need to understand and actually is a key assumption in your business case. There has been a concern, which I've heard in other conferences, about other changes that may hit these dosage forms. Is this the one and only change that we're going to have to deal with? Are we going to see further changes? Are we going to see thresholds of F-gases come down, affecting 152A, for example? Are we going to see bioplastics coming to the fore and being needed in our products? This creates uncertainty. We are investing huge amounts of money in this switch, and we want to make sure that it is going to give us a future life for these products. One big thing that we're dealing with is the maturity of the products that we are reformulating. Most of the products that will be reformulated are already past their peak sales. They're on the decline in terms of the revenue generation that they're able to achieve. Obviously, if they stave off generics, because generics are uncertain about whether or not they can enter, that will maintain a degree of revenue, but revenues are declining for these mature products. And obviously, if they, in the meantime, lose market exclusivity, we're going to see a huge reduction in price. So understanding the market evolution of pricing before and after switching is a key assumption also in the business cases that we're dealing with. We need to understand the therapeutic trends. We need to understand the competitive environment, particularly what's going to happen if a competitor enters with a low global warming propellant, and any switching to DPI alternatives. That obviously will give us an understanding of how we maintain our market share pre or post switch. Patent expiries are key, understanding what's happening with generics. We need generics, as we heard this morning, but obviously this is a key assumption also in our business cases. Whether or not to innovate, obviously we can protect our investments if we do innovate and have patents, but whether or not exclusivities will be granted, this is something that we've discussed over the last 2 days and it is key here. Ultimately, healthcare systems will want to see year-on-year reductions in price, and we are already facing this in Japan. We always have every 2 years price reductions. Actually, in the last few years, we've had every year price reductions, and that's just a fact of life. So we have to build in that margin in order to be able to have a commercially viable product in all markets. Then once we've had approval, how do we actually manage this switch, having had that approval? Because of the different regulatory timelines and expectations, we would expect that we will have to roll out these switches over a long period of time, many years, and actually maintain the current product on the market alongside the switch product. If we are not manufacturing those products on the same line, we may not enjoy the same volume breaks that we have right now. If we are changing container closure system, we may also not enjoy the same volume breaks of pricing if we have different valves from different suppliers that we're dealing with. Typically, we make full batches and we deliver them to many markets. One full batch could satisfy 3, 4, 5 different markets. We will probably have to wait for products to be approved in multiple markets and group those approvals before we can actually roll out these changes. So a good regulatory understanding, predictability, and operational planning scenarios is the only way we're going to actually be able to keep the current product on the market and then effect an efficient switch. So in conclusion, PMDIs have been resilient dosage forms. They are affordable in many markets, but they are not actually aligned to novel product opportunities that we see in inhaled drug delivery. The trends are driving us towards more biologics, more high payload delivery. This is not compatible with PMDIs. So actually, it's not a dosage form that we're investing in for the future of inhalation drug delivery. We are investing because they are affordable dosage forms, they're resilient, and they still contribute to a large volume of inhaled products being dosed in the world today. We have to future-proof them to make sure that they are still around for the future. The decision to reformulate addresses a number of patient needs, sustainability needs, and economic factors. And pharma companies are already on the path, and we should see the first products in 2025. However, given the maturity of many products, the availability of alternatives as DPIs or otherwise, and the potential lack of compelling business cases, it is expected that a large number of currently available PMDIs will not be reformulated and will selectively exit certain markets. Security of supply, clarity around requirements, and I would really advocate for pragmatic requirements from the regulators is really going to be crucial if we're going to avoid large numbers of products not being available for patients in the future. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to iterate some of the things others have said regarding number one. Thank you for joining us the past 2 days. We really appreciate, and it's also always unique to have both different parts of CEDAR at certain conferences in this workshop. Really nice to see both O&D and OGD here at the same one, as this impacts both the shops within CEDAR. So we appreciate you all being here. I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about low global warming propellants. You guys have heard a lot about this the last 2 days. There's, unfortunately, the good and bad news is we're a little behind, but we've talked a lot about what I was planning on saying, so I'll fly through a few things. But I want to iterate again what the person just said before me was we need generics. Obviously, my name is Giuseppe Randazzo. I'm the Senior Vice President from Association for Accessible Medicines, and we advocate for generic manufacturers and biosimilars. So before I move on, I think Sally mentioned yesterday that she talked and had some history about what's happened in the past. In the past, she talked about as far as brands versus generics and the need. She talked more about the cost and what the cost was once generics entered the market and how it changed when generics were off the market. It's also about access, which is important, which is why we, of course, need generic manufacturers to continue to develop these products. These are high level. We've touched upon all of these already, so I won't hammer it too much. So, of course, at a high level, some of the consideration and challenges you've heard: regulatory constraints, consideration, and unknowns. There are still a lot of knowns. Will continue to be some unknowns for some time. The relevance of RLD characteristics. We are, from a generic perspective, we are dependent upon the RLD, which we'll talk about, and of course, everyone in the audience knows. This was mentioned by one gentleman adamantly for the past 2 days regarding potential new periods of exclusivity and IP restrictions due to patents. That's, of course, something we face every day in the generic space. Supply chain device capability, we've talked about. Comparatively limited resources. I have to put a plug in there just because I had the unique opportunity to work when I left the agency to work at a company that had both brand and a generic part of the business. And it's quite evident from a brand versus generic perspective regarding the number of FTE, well, the number of staff at a brand versus generic. So it's just one of the yet other challenges that generic sectors face. And you just heard recently, just from the slides before me, market and competitive unknowns and pressures. So I won't hit every one of these points because you've heard these over and over again. I'll talk briefly about 1 and 4, the new equipment and manufacturing site modifications. It says on the slide are needed, but we heard yesterday, I believe, from Laura from GSK. She talked about how I should have written new equipment manufacturing site modifications may be needed. That would have been also very good FDA speak. May be needed. Because she mentioned the fact that there wasn't a lot of changes they had to make at the manufacturing facility, but she did touch upon there were some changes, of course, because they selected the one propellant that would precipitated some changes, but not any major changes to the manufacturing site itself. And the last one I'll talk about is the bullet point number 4. Number 4, the switch will require the sourcing of new components. Again, just mentioned just now, and a gentleman from Honeywell was up here. There are a limited number, as to my knowledge, I'm not an expert in that field, but to my knowledge, a limited number at this time of the suppliers of these newer propellants. And that may change in the future. We don't know. We just heard some people here are making and developing new facilities. That's good. But how will that impact not only brand manufacturers, but of course, generics? I think this really hit home for me yesterday when I believe it was the gentleman from GSK talked about his development of a product. And there was a question from the audience that asked, you had a 2,000 liters, and they went back and forth regarding, how do you get that much propellant? And of course, what came up next was cost, which is always an issue. Regulatory constraints considerations continued. Yeah, we've talked about this over and over and over again. But as we know, in theory, an ANDA holder can submit a supplement seeking a reformulated product with an LGWP. That would be a supplement, and an ANDA would need to, of course, demonstrate bioequivalence to the RLD. But of course, we just don't know. We use, or at least I use, the example here that has been mentioned, the albuterol, PSG, and there are 2 options. I think they did a really good job this morning talking about this. Both, I believe, as OG staff Rachel and Elizabeth talked about this. Option 1 and 2. At a high level, option 2 appears to be more burdensome than option 1. So what that means is, the last bullet point, what that means is ANDA holder may prefer to simply wait to see what the RLD will do and will you switch. And then they can actually be bioequivalent or do studies and test determination to make the new product bioequivalent to the newer product. That's a brand product, if that makes sense. But again, it's a waiting game for generics. So with that in mind, What we don't know specifically exactly what and when to expect changes. Of course, we heard yesterday there are applications at the FDA. We still don't know. We don't know, number one, when those products will be approved. We also don't know, more importantly, and now we did touch upon a PAS and B1 or B2 option. We do know right now, at least the current thinking from O&D, is it will require, because the propellant would be considered a new excipient, it would require clinical information. That may change, as they discussed the last couple of days. That may change over time. But again, for us, for the generic sector, we just don't know. So we're not certain of the path. So that's a waiting game. There's obviously a huge dependency, as everyone knows, once again, on the RLD. A&D holders may need more time. It's a little prelude to my next point, next slide. May need more time for the NDA holders to switch to a LGWP. And finally, this might even be my last slide. And finally, some other considerations. And I think there's only one slightly provocative thing on the bottom here, but how can we provide, and should we provide, of course, more time to NDAs to switch? Of course, we are going to advocate that they should. You know, when an RLD is being reformulated, as we've heard again yesterday, public knowledge, applications that are there, there will be new products that you can reference. But of course, that will take some time. I believe, once again, it was Kalpana in the audience yesterday talked about time to getting a product to market. That is a waiting game for us. We have to wait till that goes through the process, is approved. And then once again, you're dealing with, of course, patents and exclusivity, potential patents and exclusivity issues. But once again, it's a waiting game. I spoke with Luke, I believe it was, from the EPA yesterday that talked about this, again, application-specific allowances and how we're pushing it. They're pushing it back to 2030, ideally. I believe the FR notice was out there now, right? So you're still waiting on comments or something like that? Close. Thank you, sir. But hopefully we get those allowances to 2030. And again, the only provocative thing we would add is maybe if you can get this delineated in a rule, I'm not sure you can, does it make sense to actually permit generic manufacturers even more time beyond some of the brand products? That's really the only provocative statement I have. With this, I think I'm done. I think I've probably caught everyone up, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask Lei Zhang and Sally Seymour to join us on the panel. Okay. All right. So we understand that what the shift we're currently going through represents a critical intersection of environmental responsibility, regulatory innovation, and public health. Our goal today is to foster that dialogue, and I think we're very fortunate because we do have a recent historical lesson with the transition of from CFCs to HFAs. We know that it would pose a multifaceted challenge for pharmaceutical industry, particularly for generic manufacturers, and a coordinated effort between industry and regulators focusing on proactive planning, communication, and support could have significantly reduced the risk of shortages. Before I open the floor to the questions from the audience, I'd like to send a question to Health Canada. We have Health Canada on the line. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm on the line, but I do not have a feed, video feed.
So the question,
organizer. Yeah.
So the question to our colleagues in Health Canada, can you elaborate on Health Canada's regulatory approach to approving OIPs that transition from HFA formulations to LGWP propellants? And are there any unique considerations specific to Canada?
So thank you for your invitation to the workshop on PMDI propellant transition to allow me to reiterate Health Canada's commitment to Kigali's amendment to reduce use of FHAs, which was ratified by Canadian government in 2017. Now, regarding Health Canada's approach for PMDIs transitioning from formulations with HFA propellants to the next generation LGWP propellants, I can offer the following high-level overview of the regulatory pathway for the subsequent entry products. So the propellant replacement is considered by us to be a major formulation change with potential ramifications on product performance and therefore safety and efficacy profiles. Aside from the data which is required to establish quality and safety of the novel next generation propellant, Health Canada recommends comparative pharmacokinetic studies to establish comparative safety and efficacy between the proposed and the reference products. In general, a single dose PK study with charcoal block may be used to assess comparative efficacy, and a single dose comparative PK study without charcoal block may be used to assess comparative safety. For more details on the design and conduct of these PK studies, I would like to draw your attention to 2020 Health Canada guidance document on our website. This document delineates criteria where it may be possible to establish safety and efficacy of some OIPs based on in vivo comparative pharmacokinetic studies combined with in vitro studies without the need for comparative clinical studies with clinical endpoints. I also want to highlight here that this PK regulatory approach for PMDIs would also apply to other scenarios such as comparative PK studies in support of the equivalence of subsequent entry products to the CRPs, Canadian reference products, bridging studies, where the formulation for device to be marketed is different from the formulation or device used in the pivotal clinical trials, or for studies in support of significant post-approval changes and line extensions. We encourage sponsors to consult with Health Canada early and often to obtain the most recent guidance for specific drug products and to ensure, and in order to ensure smooth propellant transition of your product.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm opening the floor for the questions.
Yeah.
Please proceed.
I'm back. And this is a relatively straightforward and I think easier one. And the question is to Mark Boelens. You mentioned in your talk that you provide safety information to your customers. I would be curious to know, and without revealing it, you can't, but in terms of toxicology and safety data, what types of data or extent of data do you think will end up in your master file that drug product applicants can refer to? And then I'd ask Geraldine and Sally to weigh in on if they think that has any impact on commercial viability for the propellant or long-term safety of the studies of the propellant based on what may appear in the master file. Thank you.
So at present, the information, the safety information that is available in our DMFs, I talked about during the presentation, is containing all of the required non-clinical data.
Can you elaborate in terms of that relative to the needs that FDA expects and that your customers need?
Well, we have been talking about toxicology studies, PK studies, CMC data, quality data, stability testing. Well, the whole suite that one would require for an NDA approval.
My name is Lloyd Brito. I work as an independent consultant, so I really don't have an axe to grind here. When I come here to ask questions, it's primarily focused on what can be done to improve access of medicines to patients. So I've asked a few questions over the last couple of days. So this particular question is directed, to the suppliers of the propellant. So the first question that I have is, it was raised this morning about the availability of the propellant going forward in the future. So what commitment is being made by the suppliers of the propellants to make sure that they not only have adequate supply available, but the cost is going to be reasonable? Because in many countries around the world, price is absolutely critical. they can't afford a more expensive medicine. So that's one question. The second question for Mark, you mentioned that the HFO propellant has a double bond in it, and therefore it is more reactive. So can you explain that in spite of the enhanced reactivity, that from a biochemical nature, the tox studies did not show any sort of problems associated with that? I'm sure there is a good reason, and you being a scientist probably can explain why that's the case. And the reason I'm asking this question is all the safety studies that you have done so far, they've been in animals, and there have been some studies I know that have been done for your submission, in the European Union for breastfeeding. So as these products get more and more widely used in the patient population, is there a concern that in the wider population, you could or may see, some safety-related problems? The last two questions that I have is, I think Geraldine already talked about PFAS. And so from a PFAS perspective, where does Honeywell stand on it right now? And then one other final question is for both Honeywell and Orbia. Where exactly are you with your DMF submission? Has it been fully submitted to the FDA? And is the FDA reviewed it? And are they accepting the submission as it stands? So sorry for asking multiple.
Thank you. We'll make sure to keep it one question for each. Mark, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so the first question, Lloyd, that I noted was about availability and cost. Being a scientist, I can comment on the manufacturing, the premises that we built to make this happen. With regards to cost, as a scientist, I'd like to defer that to our commercial folks. They are in the room. So maybe during the break, you can elaborate on that a little bit more. Then on the stability, as we all know, the carbon fluorine bond is very stable. And we have been showing that over the past decade or more. We also have ongoing stability testing up to five years as required. But once an HFO with a double bond emits into the atmosphere, it gets exposed to sunlight, and then we're talking about atmospheric chemistry, and this is where the double bond becomes prone to degradation, explaining the short atmospheric lifetime.
So biochemically, that's not a
Stable.
problem.
Once in the air, different story. PFAS.
Can you answer the question about DMF, please?
Is that a continuation question?
It's my question.
Okay.
Yeah. So with regards to the status on DMF, all our DMFs are actually active and current. It includes all of the latest information, including the two CARC studies that I referred to, which were completed very recently. With regards to the review by agencies, we at least have in one of the jurisdictions I mentioned, I can confirm that the agency has reviewed it and it was successfully referenced for an application.
Thanks.
Next question.
Chime in to answer on that pricing too. It's really quick. I'm Andrew Van Dusen. I'm the GM for the business side that Mark was referring to. So just quickly to answer a question on pricing as well, because I know that is something that's come up for HFO, and it is a new, molecule that did take decades to invent, which means it does come, with a certain level of proprietariness. But like price is something that we've always kept in mind and make sure that we are providing an accessible product to the market. We know that with the HFC transition and phase down, you look at 227EA, and as that's been phased out, the cost has just gone up incredibly, and that's something we're cognizant of to make sure that we can provide something that's accessible across the market. So just wanted to put that in there too.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. Uwe Niesner from Beatrice. I have a question to Karolina Törneke. So we heard today that US FDA as well as Health Canada and MHRA are likely to require, once the new propellant is established, its safety and efficacy, at least PK study charcoal without charcoal block in order to register existing products and transition them. So EMA has taken a different approach with a stepwise approach where CMC data may suffice if you show in vitro comparability. Can you please explain on your considerations in that context as to why PK studies were not considered as a fundamental piece of evidence once the safety is established?
Karolina, you're on mute.
Unmute, that's not a good idea. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep, great. Our thinking were along the line that we wanted to handle this situation with the switch of propellants the same way as we do for other variations and extensions. So we didn't see a need to ask for PK data just because this would be something different, but rather we thought that if it's possible to fulfill all criteria for particle size distribution and all other criteria that goes with it, we should be in the same situation as we should be after other kind of changes to the formulation. This said, we expect that in most cases, if not all, there will be a need for PK data, because we have learned during those days that it's quite difficult to make the changes to the propellant in an adequate way when you have. We expect that most companies, for most products, there will be a need for PK data. But if someone managed to fit into our quite tight acceptance limits, we would be ready to grant a buy waiver. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. The difference to the other authorities is then that you need to fulfill the CMC criteria and PK studies on top. I think that currently the difference which I see in this meeting. Thanks.
And that kind of difference would go also if you apply for generic, for instance.
Correct. Thanks.
Thank you.
My question is for Mark. Mark, we heard about, just from manufacturing perspective and how BHFA 134 and 227, can you comment from Honeywell experience about the related substance? And is that something which guidance does, quality guidance does stipulate about the requirement of related substance and impurities? Does Honeywell look into that perspective for all the related substance, and how close are they with the 134 and 227? And would that be toxicologically evaluated by, what the data is going to be provided? My other question is about the compendial standard. Does Honeywell consider with petitioning the USP, including this monograph? And has there been discussion around with the suppliers in terms of including this in the monograph, and how do they align in terms of related substance impurity? As I understand the manufacturing process is going to be different and the impurities generated is going to be different. How is manufacturers, suppliers are really aligning, and are they discussing with each other? I think that's a big challenge. If we can have it compendial, but at the same time understanding we can have one monograph focusing on all the related impurities. How does that, some discussion. Thank you.
Can you repeat the first question, because I didn't understand fully what the question was. The first one
was about the related substance impurity. Again, there are some organic impurity and related substance impurities, which for 134 and 227 and the CMC quality guidance does spell out those impurities. But I'm not sure about it, whether with the newer propellants, is there some consideration given, and is any kind of a form of toxicological assessment done on those?
With regards to the purity profile, obviously, we have been in the manufacturing of HFOs, as I said, for more than a decade. So we know exactly which impurities to look for, to characterize, etc. With regards to the propellant we are discussing today, obviously we have that available in multiple grades. The same molecule goes also into refrigeration applications, obviously with a very different profile. So we have built over the past decade good knowledge about the chemistry, and obviously for MDI purposes, the purity is extremely high, and the few impurities that are in there are well characterized and also part of our DMF submission.
Just to add one point, Mark, there. This is Sandeep Mukhi from Honeywell. I'm toxicologist. To address your question regarding the impurity profile, yes, we have done the detailed analysis of the impurity profile, and the limit has been set, meeting the industry standard as well as the US FDA standard. So if you have any specific question, we can discuss, take it offline and discuss, but yeah, fully characterization has been done.
And on the USP, I'm going to defer to Nilesh.
Yeah, to answer the question about USP, so we are already in discussion with USP for the monograph registration. So the process has been already started. My question is to Paul, Health Canada. So do you have any specific quality consideration for the novel propellants? I know you talk about quality or clinical consideration for the drug product, but do you have anything specific for the novel propellant manufacturers?
A very good question. So that's not my area of expertise, but we would expect for a novel propellant, we would expect a full quality package, as well as, of course, data to establish the safety of the product.
Thank you.
We have a question for MHRA. What are your thoughts on reducing divergence in data requirements to support the transition to LGWP propellants, and how can harmonization help manufacturers?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think at this stage, these discussions that we've been having between regulators, and they've been going on for a bit of time, and sharing our thoughts are very valuable here, and also hearing from the industry. And when we've been meeting with companies, they have shared with us what advice they've had from other regulators. And I think this is really important to share the information so that we can kind of come to a more harmonized approach. I think also we have, as Nithya mentioned in his talk, the international recognition procedure in the UK. So this is where we can take account of reference regulators' decisions and do a targeted assessment by MHRA. So this may help as well. But I think really it does come down to this is really we're kind of at the beginning of this. We haven't actually seen much, if any, data yet. So I think it is an evolving picture, and I think as we go through it more, the harmonizations and consistency can be built in.
Thank you for that. Our next question is for FDA. Could manufacturers count on receiving waivers for propellant-only studies if an approved product already exists? And how might this streamline the regulatory process in the US?
This is on. We will consider the propellant-only safety studies for particular programs. I think we've been seeing that request more with the reliever albuterol manufacturers. So if your proposal is to include that in your program, we can certainly entertain that and go through the appropriate process.
Thank you so much. Lei, do you have a follow-up?
No, I do not.
Thank you. All right, our next question is actually directed to Victoria. As we navigate the reformulation process, grouping variations may become necessary when multiple elements like valves or manufacturing sites are changing. So from an industry perspective, is it better to decouple these changes or address them altogether?
I think ordinarily, if we weren't in this situation, we would address them all together. We it's industry practice to group variations and get them through as one submission. However, you've heard for the last 2 days how changing as little as possible will potentially allow us to have a lesser requirement in terms of either the stepwise approach in the EU or maybe even the abridged or abbreviated clinical approaches potentially in the US. So I think it depends on the product. As I said in my talk, if certain variation type changes are needed anyway of the product, you might consider getting those through in time. Of course, if it's a global product, you're going to have to go country by country, and every country has very different timescales for the types of variations. But if they're due and tells, do them if you can, get them out of the way, and then go in with your reformulated product with as little changes as you can get away with. That's one tactic. Delay variations until after submissions are done. It's a very complicated situation because a lot of variations are done to protect viability. They're done to maintain margin at times. So obviously, as I said before, given the uncertainty of the timeframes between now and actually switching the product, you're going to have to keep your current product commercially viable. You can't let that necessarily go into the red for too many years. Otherwise, your management is going to basically say, we're getting out of this business ahead of a switch, right? So do the necessary variations, try to get them through in time, and keep your submission as simple as you can. But that's an ideal, and I recognize that that's not going to be the case for everybody.
Thank you. Okay, so more for a broader implications aspect, the following question is an access question. So what are the next steps do you believe stakeholders should prioritize as they transition to these propellants and it becomes a reality? Giuseppe, that's for you.
Thank you. Can you repeat that?
So what do you believe are the next steps that stakeholders should prioritize as the transition becomes more of a reality?
Okay, thank you. First and foremost, something like this, I think the continued conversation we have with not only, of course, since we're in the US FDA regulators, broad conversations, of course, bringing in, as I mentioned previously, bringing in different parts of CDER, OND and OGD, and seeing them working collaboratively together on this is a very important step, and we appreciate that. Industry, I think, just following conversations and working with vendors across the board. Those are all important steps. I don't anticipate any of this making it into any other type of work day to day, like an UFA type of thing. Who knows? But I think the important thing is to continue conversations and make sure we are aware of, from the generic sector, what's going on. So any type of transparency would be helpful too. So we'll take a moment to thank again OG and OND as the repetitive theme of come meet with us early and often to have these conversations about the transition. I think that's important too. So it's a very important step as well. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. Our next question is for EMA. So how do we determine when a certain propellant is regarded as established? What criteria or milestones are typically involved in that process?
Yes, it's not a completely easy question to answer to, because we don't know yet what we might encounter in terms of problems along the road. In theory, it should be regarded established as soon as there is a product on the market, because then all data should be there in place. Still, we cannot say for sure that the first product will be representative of all products that might come in terms of how much propellant is used and what findings were there. It could be that there were certain findings that would still make us regard benefit risk positive in one product, but not for another product. So I'm not really ready to say, yes, it will definitely always be the case that we just need one set of studies. But our idea is that we will probably only need one set.
Thank you. Our next question is for Zhang. What mechanisms are available for applicants to engage with multiple agencies when seeking approvals across multiple jurisdictions?
Thank you for the question. I think currently there's some mechanism in addition to like individually reach out to the regulatory agencies. There's some, for example, between FDA and the EMA, there's a parallel scientific advice pathway that may be utilized for this kind of discussion, especially if you're looking for application to both agencies, as well as there's no like well-established guidance. Especially in this case, I feel like FDA probably only have the product-specific guidance and EMA has their Q&A. And also you also see there's not complete aligned. So that will be a good opportunity if for a specific product, you can reach out to both agencies concurrently to get some advice, because the parallel advice actually pathway for new drugs has been established since 2005. For generic, we just started about 3 years ago. So that can be considered, I think could be one of the mechanism. I also believe you heard from MHRA, they also have the IRP pathway, and some other agencies probably have very similar kind of concurrent advice pathways available. You may want to consider, but these are just for very drug specific pathways. Between agencies, we also have the generic drug cluster as a forum for the regular, like we at least have 7 members now from global regulatory agencies to meet regularly on a quarterly basis. And this topic also has been already discussed for the past 2 years. So we can continue to use that forum to reach alignment, convergence, especially when to prepare for the future harmonization in terms of a recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. We have more online questions. This one is directed to you, Mark. Could you please comment on the toxicity assessment and degradation to trifluoroacetic acid when exposed to atmosphere?
Sure. Indeed, TFA is formed, I'd say, in a de minimis amount, actually less than 2%. And as things stand today, TFA is known as a corrosive acid. And in Europe, there is regulatory action underway to review the new data available on TFA. But again, the conversion to TFA is de minimis, and therefore we don't consider that as a concern.
Thank you so much. Our next question is directed to Health Canada. Does Health Canada require comparative efficacy studies with clinical endpoints to support the transition to LGWP formulations? And if so, under what circumstances?
Okay. The change in propellant is considered to be a major formulation change that may significantly impact PMDI's product performance. So it's our position that comparative PK studies with and without charcoal are more sensitive to detect formulation differences than comparative clinical studies with clinical endpoints, especially for locally acting complex products with flat dose response, such as LABAs and ICSs. Therefore, when comparative PK studies do not meet the bioequivalence criteria, it is recommended that the proposed product is reformulated.
Thank you so much. Back to EMA. If a generic product transitions to an LGWP propellant before the brand product does, how might the EU determine reference products for subsequent entries?
Well, we have always the possibility to designate a reference product which is not the brand leader in case of the brand leader is not available or the originator product is not available. So that could be the case. Else, we always recommend as a reference product, a product with a full file. So it could be that we come into a situation where a generic with a green propellant, is that what they have been called over those days? One of the new propellants is included in the generic, but the reference product has not yet changed. But that could be the case, that they have different propellants, test and reference in that case. So all possible options are open.
Thank you so much. Back to MHRA, the question online is not so clear, but it asks for elaboration on the IRP process specifically for the transition to these propellants.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the context of the question is, but the IRP is open for applications for a change in propellants as for any other variation or initial application. And we would take account of the opinion of the reference regulator, but it would be a targeted assessment by the MHRA. So I think in advance of seeing an application and seeing the data, it's actually very difficult to comment on how it would end up. But I think Nithya did go through that. In most cases, we expect the decisions would likely be consistent with the reference regulator, but there may be some deviations. And in case that there was deviations, this would need to go to our independent Commission for Human Medicine. So it would be, fully reviewed in that case. So yeah, I'm not sure how much more I can say on that one. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Our question goes back to Geraldine, Victoria. From an industry perspective, why is it important to have regulatory guidance and clarity in regions where environmental incentives may not be as pronounced, such as those not bound by F-gas regulations?
Yeah, and I think we have a specific example when we talk about Japan. Perhaps the incentives there to switch are not as great as we see in Europe, for example. The supply chains that we're dealing with are global. Our product is manufactured in the UK. It's sold widely in Europe and is sold in Japan and rest of the world territories where perhaps environmental incentives are not so great. So it is very much a global product and therefore impacted by the economic pressures, prescribing pressures and general sustainability pressures that hit us in various territories. And so we have to manage that product for all of its markets, but not make changes or drive the reformulation of the product differently for each and every one of the 35 countries that it's in. So we do need to make these changes now. The economic drivers for the change have made us start on this transition and reformulation actually for many years ahead of this point. And by the time we're actually through this, and you can see that there is still a certain degree of uncertainty, so it's going to take time, and it's going to take time to switch. But by the time that happens, I can guarantee that lots of other countries will be clearer and will have accelerated their requirements. We saw, I think, in one of the first talks, how much impact this could have to the global warming. And we've seen some terrible floods and terrible things happening in the world today. We shouldn't wait because regulations are not there in certain countries. We should take action now. And in fact, if we don't take action now and secure supply chains, push for regulation clarity in the major territories, which then perhaps could be looked at as precedents in some of the other territories, if we don't do that now, it will not happen for those other territories that are not so concerned about it right now.
Great point. Thank you so much. So Giuseppe, in your presentation, you mentioned patient access as a concern. So can you expand on why a shift in these propellants may impact patient access, especially in underserved regions?
Sure, thank you. I think it's very important. Again, I just started my presentation with we need generics. We've heard it from a few people, and Geraldine mentioned this as well. I think it's pretty simple. I think from a access perspective and from a cost perspective, we've seen over time and time again, and I'll speak specifically to the US, what it does as far as for cost, what this competition does, and that drives down costs. Which makes sure, of course, there's more access to these products for a large group of patients. And while the paying system and payer system is very complex in the U.S., we have seen that over time. So my concern is, and I'll bring up Geraldine again, is we don't want to see manufacturers leaving this space. The fewer manufacturers you have in this space, that can potentially decrease access to products. And I think, again, there were a couple of examples discussed in the last couple of days. So that's our perspective. We want to make sure there's space for the generic manufacturers. We want to make sure the generic manufacturers stay in the space. And just simply with that alone, that maintains and enhances access to these types of products for patients.
Thank you so much. Going back to FDA, how can FDA collaborate with other agencies to support global transition? And what opportunities do you see for harmonizing efforts?
We've had some discussions with some of the international regulatory agencies about the switch. So we're aware that there are differences in our approach. I do think you've heard that we're early in the process, and I do think that as we get a little more experience, get some data, and actually have some better understanding of the changes we're going to see in the different qualities of the products, that I do think you'll probably see more of an alignment in our approach. But it's still early. So I do think we've had some communication. We know there are differences. I think they've got some comments on their Q&A document that they're probably going to respond to. So we each have our own processes we're going through, but we're aware of what they're recommending, and hopefully there will be alignment at some point here.
Can I just comment? One thing I was going to say that I've heard a lot over the last 2 days is that we're early in this transition from the regulators. And from a regulatory point of view, and especially the FDA, given the lack of data that you'll have seen up to this point, you are early in your transition. But in terms of industry, we are late. We have already gone far beyond the point for many products in making the decisions. And in not having clarity around the cost and the burden of the change has led to a situation where it may already be too late for many products. So how do we actually get to a situation where regulators feel like they're getting access to data? And actually having 2 days of discussion here is one way of getting information. But we need to have a situation where regulators can actually begin to see data come together, potentially with the requirements, and underpin the kind of business cases that I was talking about for industry to transition, because this is a dosage form that is not being underpinned by novel products. Novel products will not use PMDIs. And so the imperative is now to make sure that we secure supply for the world, not just for the US, of affordable medicines, because DPIs are quite expensive in most territories, even for the US. And if we lose the PMDI dosage form, we're not just going to have the kind of situation that we heard about earlier in pediatrics with steroids, but for every type of PMDI that we currently have on the market. So, I mean, I don't want to be, the bearer of doom and gloom just before Christmas, but I think we do have everybody in this room and everybody listening in, we are the people who can actually come together, be proactive, and drive for the pragmatism that we need to be able to transition now. And I think we heard Richard Dolby actually calling us to action to do that yesterday. Now is the time. If we do not do it now, we will be too late.
I was going to say, do you want me to respond? I don't have the answer for you, but I do think that this workshop has been very helpful and insightful to get a lot of feedback about, I think, a lot of uncertainties with the approach that we've outlined, that quite frankly, I hadn't known until this workshop were uncertainties, because we didn't get that feedback from companies. We've not had a lot of companies come to us. So even though you say you're early in the process, we're not seeing a lot of companies come and talk about their programs. So I think if you are developing a product, you should come and talk to us so that we can try and provide clarity about your program. But I think I've taken a lot of feedback this past couple days, and we meet regularly with an OGD and OND about this transition. It's not that for lack of us trying to coordinate, streamline internally, it's just very complicated and trying to figure out how to minimize unintended consequences and work within our regulatory framework as well. But I understand the need for clarity, and we also understand the need for streamlining our programs. So we hear you. We'll take this feedback back, but I encourage you to come in and talk with us about what your proposals are and your plans are for your products.
Yeah, Sally, can I just respond to when you said that not many people have come to you? Over the last 6 to 7 years, there have been so many publications. You go to any conference on respiratory drug delivery or the drug delivery to the lung these days, more than half of the papers are about this transition. So the data is out there. So I don't know what else beyond this you're looking for. Are you looking for actual submissions to be made, or that you have the data to show how well it is working or it is not working? So is this something that you all are looking at in depth to see what has already been done? Yeah.
I think we're probably looking for actual data from programs to see what differences we're going to see in the product quality characteristics. I mean, right now we've seen some data over the past couple of days that lines up very nicely. I don't know if we're going to see that for all the products. There's still some uncertainties for us. And I think until we have reviewed an application or two and actually see the data in totality and understand it, that probably the uncertainties may be lessened, and the programs then might be a lot more streamlined.
I agree. Most of the data that you're seeing is in vitro data.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is more, is that in vitro data that is being generated, is it generating any concern from a patient perspective in terms of whether it is PK or PD type studies?
Again, I mean, we haven't seen packages with the data to fully review at this point. What we've seen over the past couple of days has lined up well. I think some of the questions that I've heard from us referencing the PSGs are, and the idea of trying to show equivalence between the products is that there may be certain product quality characteristics that are less relevant for that. And we haven't seen any of that data, but it does seem to be something where we can prioritize what we think is important. And I think those are the kinds of feedback that we can take internally and try and clarify with the guidance we give companies. Because I think by just referencing the PSGs, we've probably created a little more maybe confusion and not necessary clarity about what we're looking for. So I think let us take that feedback back from this conference and see if we can clarify what we think is important from the CMC, what we think is important from the PK program as well, because I think there was some good feedback about the role of the charcoal block PK study and some challenges with conducting that, that, you know, are things we need to consider. So I think there's been good feedback that we need to think about.
No, I really commend the organizers of this meeting. I think you have done an excellent job. You've got so many good presentations and you've really opened the door to a lot of things. So thanks a lot for that. I appreciate it. So
Can I just make a comment that I'm sure that at the time that the EU came up with a Q&A document, which was so fundamentally, you know, important for us to be able to make decisions to reformulate in Europe, they also had very little data and would have seen very little at that point. And we're looking more at scenario plans and hypothetical situations to allow them to create something that was reducing the risk and giving some clarity to companies. Obviously, they can, each case is a case by case, and they will see actual data now and obviously amend their requirements as they see the data come through. But they also were not seeing very much at the time, but they came up with such a fundamentally important document.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We have reached the end of our session. Are we open to taking one last question? One last question, please. Thank you.
I have one point to add, just relate to the generic drugs in this issue. Well, you already heard from the previous FDA presentation. We have GDUFA science research support oral inhaled products like since GDUFA 2 or even before that. So we do have those research we can leverage to support this new issue. And the difference between us and other agencies are well known of, and that's also in the horizon of being harmonized, hopefully in the ICH. And you're also probably aware the generic harmonization of the ICH just started about like 5 or 4 years ago, and we just published the first harmonized guidance for BE for immediate release oral dosage form. But the more complex product, including the oral inhaled product, will be next on the horizon, but that does take time. Therefore, you're also aware FDA do have the global generic program, which led by Sarah, and also a lot of us are involved to help support those convergency prior to harmonization. As I mentioned earlier, the generic drug cluster is one of the forum. And I also echo to what Sally said, we just really hope the industry will come to meet with us early and often, right? You heard this message over and over. So we will give you very product specific advice. And also we also learn from your development program and to give, hopefully will help us to provide more harmonized recommendation in the future. That's just what I want to add. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to say thank you for your willingness to look at some of the information that's coming out there about the new propellants in new drugs before it reaches you, because I think, as Geraldine mentioned, you're not likely to see huge numbers of applications because it's not a particularly attractive platform for NCEs. So I definitely invite you to come to a respiratory drug delivery meeting and learn a little bit more about some of the issues. But I did have a question for Mark and Geraldine about the sort of uncertainty around PFAS regulations. CFCs, MDIs in the big scheme of things are not a major contributor to the issues we're seeing. You know, refrigeration and things like that play a much bigger role, and yet we're all here today talking about them. So to say that the newer low global warming propellants are negligible contributors to PFAS may not be enough to defend against regulations that create uncertainty for industry, and potentially it could lead to, you know, calls for what would it be now, generation 4 propellants. So I'm wondering how you would, Geraldine, and you would respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was a curveball. We didn't need it, and actually, it really rocked us. And potentially, you could see that in what's happened to Vectura in the last year around this. But I think, you know, we have to look at the science. We listen to what Mark says about the persistence in the environment of this particular PFAS propellant. And we are confident that ultimately that clarity around, this not being an issue for HFO is going to be there. It is not going to be clear in a short time frame, and I think Mark will probably, discuss that in a second. But at some point, we had to take a view, and this PFAS situation isn't just around the propellant. It's in everything that we do. And when we think about the container closure system, we're dealing with suppliers N-1, 2, 3, 4. There is PFAS everywhere. And so, I think many of you know that Vectura has been sold, and we've had to address that as part of that process, to really understand our supply chains, to work out where is PFAS and what are we doing about it, and what do we think about risk. And it's particularly pertinent in the US, where there's been some class action lawsuits, but it's actually permeating now into Europe and into all areas. So PFAS isn't just an issue of the propellants, it's in everything we do.
Yeah, my answer is actually twofold. In the first place, when we talk about the harmonization, if I look at the working definition of US EPA on PFAS, explicitly HFOs are not considered PFAS for obvious reasons. Why is that? Because what has triggered the whole scrutiny on PFAS are the well-known culprits. We all know C6 to C9, the PFOAs, the PFOS of this world. EPA takes the position that carbon chain length matters when it comes to toxicity. Well, I can't agree more. And we're actually sitting on a new approach methodology, tox studies that are underscoring that. So my previous answer was probably a bit too short and simplistic, but I'd say let the good science prevail. And also harmonize across the jurisdictions. The EU should recognize the good science and take responsibility there. And then the second answer is much more of a regulatory legal certainty answer. And with that, I mean, I explained in length how we moved from CFCs to HCFCs, HFCs, HFOs. You can't drive innovation and change across the industry and then through the back door come with a restriction that doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, today there are 300 million cars on the road loaded with HFCs with HFOs to have your air conditioning work. Do we want to shut down mobility? Talking about cars, in your car there are 6 to 7 million. I repeat, 6 to 7 million PFAS parts. You want to replace them? Good luck. You want still taking airplanes? Any one of us in this room has manufacturing facilities. You can't have a valve in your equipment that has no Teflon because it needs to be tied and sealed. So we want to stop producing chemicals. I mean, this is, I think, an over-enthusiastic approach from 5 countries in the EU. It's only a proposal, but at the end of the day, it's the European Commission that will hold the pen to write up the restriction, and they will apply common sense. Read my lips.
Hey, thank you so much. And to be mindful, thank you for the panelists and speakers who are also joining us from across the globe. Thank you so much, everyone.